An airplane is the safest mode of transportation. Alas, even today, some of them may crash. However, what modern passenger airplanes cannot do is disappear without a trace and without reason. Nevertheless, there is the story of Flight 370. On the night of March 8, 2014, a Boeing 777 took off from the airport in the capital of Malaysia. The destination was Beijing, China. This was a regular daily flight operated by Malaysia Airlines. On board were over 200 passengers and crew members. 30 minutes after takeoff, the captain of the aircraft would make his final contact with the ground. 40 minutes later, the Boeing would disappear not only from radars, it would vanish entirely, along with 200 passengers. Consequently, this case would become one of the greatest mysteries in the history of aviation.
The disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight
370 disappeared.
The Malaysia Airlines flight has gone missing.
Several countries would participate in the investigation of the incident and the search for the aircraft, spending several years and hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet, to this day, no one, from official authorities to participants in conspiracy forums, can provide a definitive answer to what happened. Was the plane hijacked? Did a terrorist attack occur? Did the equipment fail? Did the captain take his own life? Was the plane struck by lightning or a meteorite, or was it shot down by the military? Those connected with aviation know well that a large modern passenger airplane cannot simply disappear. Advanced equipment on board the aircraft, radars on the ground and satellites in space all precisely indicate where the plane is at any given moment of flight. Even if it crashes, the equipment will make it clear where, when, and ultimately why it happened. None of this applies to Flight 370. 10 years later, no one knows what happened to it. In this video, we will attempt to solve the mystery of the missing Boeing. We will fully follow the flight chronology, study the reports, analyze the theories, and understand where, most likely, the truth lies. Okay, let us clarify several technical details right away to avoid further confusion. The missing Malaysia Airlines plane had the code number MH370. The model of the missing plane was the Boeing 777. This is one of the largest and most advanced types of airliners in the world. Both have 3 digits, both have 7s, so people far from aviation might get confused. The first is the code of the specific aircraft. The second is the model of the aircraft manufactured by Boeing. Essentially, this is all you need to know before we begin delving into the history of the disappearance of Flight 370, the 8th of March, the year 2014. It is a quiet, clear night. The Boeing 777 is preparing to take off from the airport in the Malaysian capital, Kuala Lumpur. The destination is Beijing, China. This is a daily flight for Malaysia Airlines, approximately 5.5 hours en route. Good weather conditions are forecasted for the entire flight. Only a couple of zones of turbulence are expected, but this is not a problem for modern aircraft. The captain of flight MH370 is Zahari Ahmad Shah. He is 53 years old and he has spent more than 30 years flying with Malaysia Airlines, including on the Boeing 777 model. A very experienced specialist with an impeccable professional reputation. The co-pilot is Farik Abdul Hamid, 27 years old. His experience is relatively short, 4 years. For Farik, this is a training flight on the Boeing 777 model. He has only completed a few flights on it. Nevertheless, the fact that the young man was able to secure the position of co-pilot on a large airliner speaks to his good professional qualities. In addition to the 2 pilots, there are 10 crew members, each with extensive work experience ranging from 10 to 30 years. On board are 227 passengers from various countries around the world, but the overwhelming majority, almost 2/3, are Chinese citizens. Before takeoff, MH370 was of course refueled. The fuel should suffice for a 7.5-hour flight, which is 2 hours more than required. This is standard practice and not the most interesting detail. However, considering what will happen later, even the most insignificant details gain some importance, including the amount of fuel loaded. Another important detail that deserves attention is the timing. At 12:40 a.m., Captain Zahari receives permission to take off.
370, 32 right of takeoff. Nice.
At 1:01 a.m., the Boeing ascends to a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, approximately 10.5 kilometers. Cruising altitude, put simply, is the level at which the plane spends most of the flight.
370, maintaining level 350.
The captain's voice sounds quite natural and relaxed. His communication with the ground dispatcher proceeds as planned. MH370 is clearly visible to all radar systems, and the flight is progressing routinely, nothing suspicious. But already 7 minutes later, strange things begin to happen. At 1:08 a.m., Captain Zahari informs the ground that the aircraft is at an altitude of 35,000 feet.
370, maintaining level 350.
The peculiarity of this message is not its meaning, but the fact of its existence. 7 minutes earlier, the captain had already reported to the ground that the plane was at 35,000 feet. The second message was clearly unnecessary and suspicious. It could have appeared for several reasons, but we will talk about them a little later, because immediately after this message, truly astonishing things begin to happen with the plane. 11 minutes later, Flight 370 is over the South China Sea. It leaves Malaysia's airspace and enters Thailand's airspace. The Kuala Lumpur dispatcher informs Zahari to contact the Vietnamese dispatcher from Ho Chi Minh City and bids farewell.
Malaysian 370, contact Ho Chi Minh 120.9. Good night.
Zahari responds with a farewell message.
Good night, Malaysian 370.
And this message is interesting for two reasons. Firstly, in his farewell, the dispatcher uttered 5 digits, which is a radio frequency. Zahari, according to the rules, should have repeated it, but he did not. Secondly, this captain's message will become the last one. The plane will not make contact with Vietnam. Almost immediately after that, the aircraft will disappear from radar screens. At that moment, one of the main mysteries in aviation history began. Of course, the first thing that comes to mind when a plane disappears from radar is that it simply crashed. However, as it will later be revealed, Flight 370 remained in the sky for many more hours. Moreover, the location where the aircraft became undetectable to radars could be considered ideal. The aircraft was no longer in Malaysian airspace and seemingly not yet in Vietnamese airspace. In other words, it was the perfect moment should someone want to make the plane invisible. Everything that occurred with the aircraft after disappearing from the radar became the main subject of investigations, speculations and conspiracy theories. We will rely on the facts, of which quite a few have accumulated over the last 10 years. To start, it is necessary to clarify the meaning of the phrase "disappeared from the radar." There are some technical details important for understanding the whole story. Throughout its flight, a passenger plane remains visible to radars, which are divided into 2 types. The first type resembles large, vertically standing dishes. Roughly speaking, they send a signal toward the aircraft and read what is reflected back from the object. This is a somewhat old-school technology and thus not very accurate in determining the aircraft's position or speed. Moreover, these radars have a limited range. Today, air traffic monitoring systems mainly rely on the second type of radar. These receive information from transponders located on the aircraft itself. The information includes the plane's position, altitude, speed, and other metrics. Thanks to this system, websites like Flight Radar operate. Here, anyone can observe passenger planes in real time, as they fly anywhere in the world. The problem with this technology is that the plane will become invisible to this type of radar if the transponders on board fail or if someone turns them off. Now let us return to the events of that night, March 8th, 2014. What happened on the ground after Flight 370 disappeared from the radar? The controller in Kuala Lumpur initially did not notice anything unusual. Apparently, he was occupied with other aircraft at that moment. When he finally noticed the absence of MH370 on the radar, he assumed the plane was already outside his territory in Vietnamese airspace. Vietnamese controllers likewise recorded Flight 370 entering their airspace, only to then disappear from their radar. According to protocol, they were supposed to contact their colleagues in Kuala Lumpur within 5 minutes if the captain of Flight 370 did not establish contact with them. However, the Vietnamese did not do this. Instead, they unsuccessfully tried to contact the aircraft for almost 20 minutes, and only after this did they report the information to the Malaysians. The controllers in Kuala Lumpur, in turn, contacted Malaysia Airlines, which responded that everything was fine. According to their data, the plane was flying according to plan over Cambodian territory. As it would later turn out, such data were based not on the actual position of the aircraft, but on the preliminary plan the airline had. But around 2 o'clock in the morning, all parties agreed that the flight was proceeding according to plan, and none of them noticed the faint signal from those very old-school radars. According to them, the aircraft did indeed continue its flight, albeit in a completely different direction from the planned one. Due to the inattention of the controllers, no one notified the Malaysian aviation authorities about the disappearance of the plane within the hour, as required by the rules. 4 more hours passed until this point. It was only when MH370 did not land at the specified time in Beijing that the situation became critical, and the aircraft was declared missing. The search for the aircraft began in the South China Sea. This was, in general, logical, as that was where contact with the liner was lost. Several dozen aircraft and ships from Malaysia and Vietnam combed the maritime space. However, no traces of MH370 were found. Only a few days after the disappearance, thanks to the collected data from the first type of radars and military radars, it became clear that Flight MH370 first made a sharp, almost 180-degree turn between Vietnam and Malaysia, crossed Malaysian territory, bypassed Indonesia, and turned sharply south, after which it flew for several more hours and finally disappeared. The flight trajectory of the aircraft suggested one thing. It was not an accident or a technical failure. It was almost certainly a well-planned action. But why? For what purpose and where are the plane and the 200 passengers finally? Searching for a needle in a haystack is not easy, but the real problem is when you don't even know where the haystack is. This roughly describes the situation the Malaysian authorities found themselves in when it became clear that the Boeing 777 did not crash in the South China Sea. Moreover, initially information about the strange path of Flight MH370 did not come from official sources but from journalists. Only after this did Malaysian authorities confirm the truthfulness of the media reports. Sometime later, the London company Inmarsat appeared in the incident's history. They deal with commercial satellites, and passenger aviation is generally not their specialization. However, in this situation, it turned out that Inmarsat's satellite data, combined with radar data on Earth, could very likely reconstruct the complete route of Flight MH370 and simultaneously rule out several of the most obvious versions of what happened. The entire path of the Boeing can be divided into two parts. The first part we know thanks to civilian and military radars, and the second was reconstructed by satellites. The first part of the flight route, which was 40 minutes until the transponders were turned off, and another hour afterward, raises no doubts. And here's why it is important. The most obvious version of what happened initially involved an emergency situation. Some systems failed, or there was a fire, or some other emergency situation occurred, and it was this that disabled those very transponders on board, transmitting information to Earth. Similar cases have happened. In the year 2010, a UPS Boeing 747 cargo plane crashed in Dubai due to an onboard fire. The investigation revealed that the cause of the fire was the ignition of lithium batteries that the aircraft was transporting as cargo. In the year 1998, a Swiss Air passenger plane crashed in Canada. The cause was a short circuit which led to a fire and the failure of critical systems on the aircraft. Flight MH370 also had cargo. Part of it included lithium batteries. As the investigation later determined, they could not have caused a fire and crash because they were packed in a special way. However, the main point is that the version of a fire on board caused by cargo or a short circuit was ruled out by the flight trajectory and other details. The fact is that at the very moment the transponders were turned off and the plane disappeared from radar, it did not happen all at once. Initially, one part of the transponder functions turned off, and 37 seconds later they shut down completely. This indicates that the cause was not a sudden event like a fire or explosion, but a manual gradual shutdown of the transponders, most likely from the cockpit. Additionally, the abrupt nearly 180-degree turn from the initial route suggests it was carried out manually by someone. It could not have been the autopilot. Subsequent tests showed that an autopilot cannot perform such an abrupt turn. Suppose there was a fire on the plane that disabled the transponders, and the pilots turned around to make an emergency landing. But they did not do that. They continued flying further. Moreover, on that first part of the route reconstructed from radars, the plane remained under manual control. This is indicated by slight deviations to the sides during the flight. This, in turn, rules out the version of pilots losing consciousness due to smoke inhalation or cabin depressurization. According to data from the Inmarsat satellite company, the second part of the flight was reconstructed after MH370 disappeared from ground radar site. This data indicates that the Boeing flew for an additional 6 hours at high speed and at a high altitude towards Antarctica, and ultimately disappeared in the southern part of the Indian Ocean. However, all this information was not immediately known. As a result, the searches took place in completely incorrect locations, which of course led to nothing. Additionally, time was lost. Had information about the aircraft's strange flight trajectory been immediately revealed, the plane might have been found. Because of this, many people, including some relatives of the missing Boeing's passengers, are convinced that the Malaysian authorities are covering up the true cause of the incident, that the plane may not have crashed at all or was shot down. We will discuss these theories a bit later. For now, we will focus on the search operation. It stretched over several years and became, by some estimates, the most expensive and extensive search operation in history. Planes and ships from several countries combed through hundreds of square kilometers over 2 months. Initially in the South China Sea, then in the Andaman Sea, where the aircraft was last seen on radar, and finally in the southern part of the Indian Ocean, where, according to Inmarsat data, the aircraft disappeared completely. After 2 months of unsuccessful attempts, the search operation focused on underwater surveys. Due to Malaysia's insufficient resources to study the depths of the Indian Ocean, the Australians joined the operation in the presumed area with more advanced equipment. Their primary task was to locate the cockpit voice recorders. Several years were spent, hundreds of square kilometers of seabed were studied, costing over $100 million, yet nothing was found. After some time, the search continued with the American commercial company Ocean Infinity. Under a contract with Malaysian authorities, the searchers were to receive compensation only upon a successful search outcome. But after several months of studying the seabed in the presumed crash area in the southern Indian Ocean, nothing was found. In July 2015, 16 months after the aircraft's disappearance, street cleaners on Reunion Island in the Indian Ocean discovered a strange object. It later turned out to be a part of the wing of a Boeing 777 called a flaperon. Thanks to the serial numbers on the flaperon, it became evident that this was a piece not just of any Boeing 777, but of MH370 itself. Subsequently, a total of 24 Boeing 777 debris pieces were found on the shores of Madagascar and nearby coastal areas. Only a few of them could be precisely identified as debris from MH370. The rest were determined by experts as most likely belonging to the missing aircraft. However, the found debris largely did not provide any new information about what had occurred. Based on satellite data, it was almost certainly evident that the aircraft fell into the southern part of the Indian Ocean. The analysis of currents in this region only confirmed that the debris would have drifted somewhere to southeastern Africa. No traces of an explosion or fire were found on the debris. This only added weight to the theory that what happened to Flight 370 was man-made. In 2018, a comprehensive report with the results of the Malaysian authorities' investigation into the incident was published. The 450-page document mostly duplicated the technical specifications and features of the Boeing 777 search operations results and radar data. The conclusion of the document stated that determining the true reasons behind the aircraft's disappearance was not possible. However, even in this essentially useless document, the authors acknowledged that the disconnection of transponders and other detection systems on board the aircraft was most likely the work of a human, and we remember that the disconnection of these systems and the subsequent sharp turn of the vessel occurred in the most ideal place to make the aircraft invisible. But who did this? And most importantly, why? Over the many years of investigating the incident, numerous theories have emerged. Some of these were based on existing facts and calculations. Such theories were most often proposed by former or current pilots or other professionals associated with aviation. They carefully analyzed the radar readings, relying on their own experience. Many of these arguments you either have already heard or will hear in the course of the discussion. However, at the same time, many other versions have appeared. These can be called speculative or conspiratorial. Some of them have become the basis for major documentary films about MH370, including, for example, on Netflix. One such conspiratorial scenario suggests that MH370 was originally shot down by the American military from the Diego Garcia base in the Indian Ocean, either because the aircraft initially intended to attack this base or because the military shot down an unidentified passenger plane that did not respond to their signals. Afterwards, supposedly, many radar data and debris were deliberately falsified to conceal what had happened. Another scenario claims that after turning over Indonesia, the plane flew not south but north and crashed somewhere over the territory of Kazakhstan. The problem with these theories is that they are contradicted by the numbers. In the professional aviation community, and we are speaking of experts from different countries around the world, there are no significant discrepancies in the MH370 route, which was calculated mathematically using various satellites and radars. Yet, what even experienced pilots cannot definitively say is what exactly happened to Flight 370. There are different versions. We will examine them in detail now. So, what we already know, based on the flight trajectory from satellite and radar data, is that we are almost certainly dealing with a man-made act. Equipment failure or human error cannot explain what occurred. Glitches of specific systems, icing, bird strikes, lightning, meteorites, volcanic clouds, mechanical failure, electronic failure, equipment error, fire, smoke, explosion, decompression, bomb, missile. None of these can explain the path taken by Flight 370. By the time the transponders were turned off, the aircraft was most likely being controlled by one of the pilots. It is hard to believe that they were acting in concert. For both, this was their first flight together. This means that the pilot not in control at that moment either could not access the cockpit because it was locked or was already unconscious. According to one version, the person at the controls after the first sharp turn ascended to an altitude of 40,000 feet, simultaneously depressurizing the cabin. The oxygen in the masks for passengers in the aircraft's cabin lasts only 15 minutes. That is, they all lost consciousness rather quickly. At the same time, the oxygen in the masks in the cockpit is sufficient for several hours. Moreover, at the moment the aircraft abruptly changed its course, not only were the transponders turned off, but also some of the other electrical systems of the plane. It is unknown for what purpose, but likely to include disabling the satellite communication systems with the aircraft, rendering it completely invisible to ground controllers. If this was indeed the case for the remaining 6 hours of the flight, there was only one person alive in the plane, and they were at the controls. Another fact supports this theory. Almost an hour later, at 2:25, some of the electrical systems were turned back on in the aircraft, including those responsible for satellite connection. Thanks in part to this, it was later possible to reconstruct the plane's full route. Besides the reactivated electrical systems, the aircraft cabin was repressurized. For everyone on board, except the person at the controls, this would have been meaningless, as none of them would have been alive at that point. This leaves us with the question of who was at the controls, one of the pilots, or was the plane hijacked? Aircraft hijackings are not exactly common occurrences, but unfortunately, they do happen. However, over time, security measures have continually increased, making it virtually impossible for an outsider to access the cockpit. On that Boeing model in 2014, the cockpit door was equipped with multiple layers of security plus video surveillance so that the pilots could see who was at the door. Additionally, the plane's first disappearance from the radar occurred just minutes after Captain Zahari casually bid farewell to the controller. It is unlikely that any of the passengers could have hijacked the plane in that time frame. Moreover, I mentioned that the disappearance and abrupt turn of the plane occurred at the most ideal moment between the airspaces of two different countries. It is improbable that the hijackers could have chosen such a perfect timing. But let us suppose that the hijackers did manage to enter the cockpit. For the captain or co-pilot to report this to the ground or send the appropriate signal, it would take only a few moments. But they did not do so. One of the theories about the hijacking of MH370 suggests that hijackers could have turned off the transponders and some systems by accessing the compartment under the cabin floor, where many systems and sensors are located. However, envisioning this occurring unnoticed by the over 200 people on board is challenging. Additionally, much of the incident investigation focused on the personal backgrounds of all 239 individuals on board, including crew members. Apart from Malaysians, FBI personnel also participated in this. As a result, 2 passengers were found to be travelling on forged passports. Further investigation revealed that these 2 passengers were Iranian citizens, and had no connections to any terrorist organizations. Most likely, they were simply trying to reach one of the more or less safe countries and then seek political asylum. Finally, as to the motive for the hijacking of the aircraft, whether a terrorist act, money or politics, everything that happened with MH370 during the 7-hour flight suggests that none of these were likely the reason. Moreover, no one claimed responsibility for the incident, and anonymity is not a typical characteristic of terrorists. Thus, we are left with not so many theories, more precisely one. The incident was organized by one of the pilots, but who and why? It is not redundant here to mention another conspiracy theory. There is the idea that the plane was actually being manually controlled all the time, but from the ground. According to this version, either Boeing was experimenting with new technology, or someone simply managed to hack the aircraft's control system. Both ideas are not taken seriously by pilots or other industry professionals. Firstly, because even theoretically, these scenarios are quite difficult to imagine. And secondly, flight data analysis indicates that the control took place directly from the cockpit. Thus, we move on to discussing those who were initially at the controls of the aircraft, Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah and First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid. Pilots are not robots, pilots are living people. Those who sit at the controls can also experience psychological problems, go through difficult moments in life, face financial difficulties, and so on. All of these could potentially be reasons why a particular pilot might hijack an aircraft or decide to end their life during the performance of their professional duties. Real examples from the history of civil aviation confirm this. In 2014, an Ethiopian Airlines aircraft with 200 passengers was hijacked by the co-pilot. The plane was flying from the capital of Ethiopia to Milan, Italy. During the flight, the captain went to the restroom, the co-pilot locked the cockpit door and took control. He then landed in Switzerland and requested political asylum. None of the passengers were harmed. In 1999, an Egypt Air Boeing on a New York-Cairo flight crashed into the ocean 30 minutes after takeoff. American investigators concluded that it was a deliberate act by the co-pilot who shut off the engines and directed the plane downwards. More than 200 people on board perished. In 2015, a German Wings aircraft from Barcelona to Düsseldorf suddenly began to descend and crashed in the Alps. As the investigation later revealed, this was a deliberate action by the pilot. He locked the cockpit door after the captain went to the restroom and directed the plane downwards. Nearly 150 people died. The reason behind the co-pilot's behavior was serious mental health issues, which he hid from the airline. And these are not all such cases, just a few examples. Therefore, during the investigation process, the pilots were examined with particular thoroughness. Their biographies, medical records, relatives, bank accounts, homes, and apartments were scrutinized. The co-pilot was 27-year-old Fariq Abdul Hamid. No details of his life indicated that he could have committed a deliberate act of crashing. His finances and health were in excellent order, and he was described by everyone familiar with him as an optimistic young man. Additionally, it seemed he was soon to be married. From a professional standpoint, everything in Fariq's life was equally well. As I said, he'd only recently been entrusted with the pilot's seat on a Boeing 777. This is a massive airliner, and receiving such an appointment at a young age is prestigious, promising him an excellent career. The only suspicious moment regarding the co-pilot was his phone. In the report by Malaysian investigators, it was stated that after the aircraft made a sharp turn from its planned route, the co-pilot's iPhone unexpectedly turned on. This happened over the island of Penang, and the connection with the phone was established for a very short period. It was not an outgoing or incoming call. The cell tower on the island merely registered contact with the device. What does this tell us? By the rules, pilots' phones must be turned off during the flight. This means someone turned on the co-pilot's phone while in the air. It might have been him, perhaps to call and report something, but this is only speculation. The true reason for the brief connection with the co-pilot's phone remains unknown. Interestingly, information about Fariq's iPhone surfaced in the press due to leaks of Malaysian investigation material. Many of these materials were never published and did not appear in the final 400-page report. Why? This is an intriguing question without a clear answer. Malaysian authorities are, of course, known for their corruption and lack of transparency, but why similar facts would be concealed is unclear. Regardless, we have no even indirect evidence indicating that the co-pilot intended to commit a deliberate act. Therefore, we move on to discussing the figure of the captain, Zahari Ahmad Shah. It should be noted that he was a very experienced pilot, 53 years old, having flown for over 30 years with various Malaysian Airlines aircraft. Since the year 1998, Zahari had been a captain on the Boeing 777 model. He had an impeccable professional reputation, was married with 3 children. Investigators found that his finances and health were in perfect order. Colleagues spoke of Zahari positively. He was stress-resistant, and before the flight, there was nothing suspicious in his behavior. Investigators also thoroughly analyzed video recordings from the airport before the flight. In them, his posture, facial expression, and other signs did not reveal any deviations in Zahari. In his free time, the pilot engaged in amateur electronics and flew a home flight simulator. Zahari even had his own YouTube channel.
This video is to be used to optimize the compressor.
In short, the ship's captain seemingly also had no motives to commit a dreadful act. However, many details from the flight analysis suggested that the captain was the main suspect. The report by Malaysian authorities regarding the pilot aroused suspicions among many. The fact was that articles started appearing in the media suggesting the captain's personal life was complicated. He allegedly lived separately from his wife and had mistresses. It is worth noting that these rumours were not publicly confirmed by Zahari's relatives. What was truly strange was the flight simulator found in the pilot's home. It was not the existence of such a device that was suspicious, but rather the flights Zahari performed on this simulator. Among the hundreds of saved and deleted flight data, investigators' attention was drawn to a route ending in the southern part of the Indian Ocean, which closely resembled the actual MH370 route reconstructed through radar and satellite. That is, the captain might have rehearsed this fateful flight on his simulator. As many aviation professionals agree, as I have noted, everything that happened with the Boeing was well prepared. A further oddity about Zahari's simulator data is that the information about such a flight was concealed from the press in a non-public report by the Malaysian authorities. They later admitted that a suspicious route on the flight simulator did exist, and it had initially been deleted by Zahari himself and was later restored by investigators. In the official report, Malaysian authorities concluded that this was not an attempt to rehearse the last MH370 flight, and part of independent researchers agree with this. In their view, it is merely a coincidence. On the other hand, if it was not a coincidence, then it turns out that Zahari indeed rehearsed the route of Flight 370. Other independent researchers discovered that this simulated flight lacked a landing point, unlike the hundreds of others. Ideally, the purpose of a simulator is that the person at the controls takes off, reaches the desired point, and lands at a specific airport. But in Zahari's case, this simulator flight had no landing point. From this, one thing becomes clear. It is absolutely understandable why Zahari was for some time the main suspect in the incident. But we cannot assert definitively that it was he who committed the moderate hijacking of Flight 370 and was responsible for its disappearance. We lack sufficient concrete evidence for this. There are only indirect conclusions. One thing is certain: the person who carried this out was very well prepared and knew what to do. And while data from several different researchers confirm the approximate crash zone of the aircraft in the Indian Ocean, we do not have a precise answer as to how the final stage of the flight occurred. Was it a gradual descent of the aircraft due to fuel exhaustion, or a more abrupt, deliberate act of lowering and crashing the aircraft? This is significant for understanding the motives. It is evident that the person at the helm throughout the flight was actively and deliberately performing the necessary actions. He was maneuvering the plane at the necessary places, disabling the electronics, moving as far as possible from the radar detection area. Could it be that in the final stage he simply passively waited for the plane to run out of fuel, while, according to some calculations, the aircraft was gradually descending instead of being sharply directed downward? At the same time, some other calculations suggest precisely the opposite. What we know almost for certain, however, is that the last hours of flight MH370 occurred in daylight. This means that whoever was at the controls, likely the only living person on board, watched as a new day began. As of today, the investigation into the incident and the search for flight MH370 have been halted. Not a single body has been found, and no debris except for those 20 pieces, which do not add clarity to the situation. This means that neither the relatives of the passengers nor the rest of the world know the exact circumstances or causes of the crash. The only hope of discovering the ultimate truth is to find more debris from flight MH370. However, considering the vast expanse of ocean that needs to be examined, and the hundreds of millions of dollars that would be required to resume the search, the likelihood of restarting the search is quite low, and the case of flight MH370 will likely remain one of the great mysteries in aviation history.